Nixtamalization. So anyway, how corn changed itself and then changed everything else. First of all, one of the things I get asked frequently is, why would you write about corn? Well, agriculture is the history of the world, but corn is the history of the United States. We pretty much just would be a completely different place if it weren't for corn. Now, first of all, I probably want to define corn. What corn means. Corn, if you look up corn, it will tell you it means the dominant cereal grain of a region. In England, wheat is corn. In Africa, millet is corn. When people first arrived in the New World, well, Columbus picked up the Taino word maíz, and that's where the Spanish get their word, maíz, and where we get the Latin name maize. And so maize is what corn is. Corn, when they got to Virginia, they frequently referred to it as Virginia wheat, just because that was their corn, and this was in Virginia. But then they also frequently referred to it as Indian corn, because it was the dominant grain for the Native Americans that they encountered here. So anyway, so you've got Indian corn. Interestingly enough, as late as 1896, my great-grandmother's Fanny Farmer's cookbook still refers to cornmeal as Indian meal. Corn really didn't become corn until the 20th century. And if you buy books over in England, it will actually say maize, known as corn in the United States. Only in the United States and Canada does the word corn always mean maize. So if you're traveling overseas and they say corn, you might not know what you're going to get. So anyway, that's where we get the term. Now, where we get corn is from Oaxaca, Mexico. Now, if you look at Mexico, it's kind of, the coast curves kind of like this. Down about here is Oaxaca. And it's one of the most unbelievably diverse ecosystems in Mesoamerica. They've got everything from mountains to beaches to rainforest to desert. And so a lot of plants develop there. There's a tremendous amount of biodiversity. And the indigenous people were very much into taking advantage of that, breeding things, creating new crops. But they actually didn't create corn. That's why it says how corn changed itself, because teosinte is a weed that it grows in Oaxaca, kind of like ambitious crabgrass. It's about 2.5, 3 feet tall, lots and lots of branches, kind of leafy, and little tiny seed heads that are just about the size of my little finger, maybe a little smaller. So teosinte, however, has a rare trait known as a jumping gene. A jumping gene is a piece of genetic material that will at unexpected times break itself off and insert itself somewhere else in the genetic code and create a new plant. And so because everything was picked by hand back then, you noticed when that happened. It's actually still happening in our cornfields, but we don't see it because we're not picking it all by hand, unless you have a small organic farm. But basically what it was is they noticed that something was different. It was bigger, it was more interesting, and so they said, let's grow this instead. So they started to develop it. They actually did a great job of breeding it. They were great plant breeders. By the time of first contact, when the first Europeans arrived, there were more than 200 varieties of corn. Now, that's one of the things about corn. Wheat, rice, there are several species. Corn, there is one species, Zea maize. But there are thousands of varieties. There are, in fact, more varieties of corn than there are of any other crop species in the world. So, huge number of varieties even by the time of first contact because of Native Americans nurturing it and developing it. So how do you keep track of all of that? Well, in 1884, a guy named Louis Sturtevant came up with a plan. He called them races of corn. And some of this nomenclature had existed before he organized it, and some of it still exists, and a lot of it has been added to. But the essential framework that was created back then was 6 races of corn. The very first one to develop 10,000 years ago, because that's when this started, 10,000 years ago, was popcorn. And popcorn was one of our clues that the corn was related to teosinte before we got to where we could take the DNA apart and figure it out. Popcorn, because teosinte pops. Now, you sometimes hear stories about early settlers having popcorn. And what they were having was parched corn. It would just break open. The stuff that turns inside out is popcorn. That actually headed south into South America. So it didn't make it into the US until the mid-1800s because whaling ships from New England were actually visiting South America following the whales and went, wow, look at this white stuff they've got. Because they didn't just eat it, they had it, strands of it. Women would wear it in their hair. It was really cool, and they thought, this is fun, let's take this home. So around the time of the Civil War, we got our first popcorn in the United States. And it was sort of an instant hit, but as a novelty. It wasn't like it is today where everybody knows about it, but it was fun. It spread quickly. So we didn't have that here until the 1800s, but that was the oldest race of corn. The next race of corn is Flint corn. Flint corn has all hard starch. So it's kind of like popcorn in texture, but it doesn't turn inside out. But Flint corn actually came up the eastern coast, eastern seaboard. Now, one of the things people don't always realize is in the 1600s, when British settlers started arriving in the New World, we were in the middle of the Little Ice Age. People froze to death in Virginia. I mean, it was really cold, and the growing season was very short, which is why the Flint corn did so well, because Flint corn has a very short growing season. You can have a mature crop in 60 days. So it does very, very well. It does well in saline soil. It does well in rocky soil. So it was great in Jamestown and New England. So it was the one that went up the coast. So when you're talking Pilgrims or Jamestown, it's Flint corn. Flint corn is very hard to grind, but it lasts for a long time. Now, the next one to be developed is flour corn. Flour corn is all soft starch. It went up the west coast into the southwest. So if you've ever had blue corn chips, your hoppy blue corn is a flour corn. It's very soft, it's very easy to grind, but it doesn't store as well. It also has about 110-day maturation period. So it was okay in New Mexico, but it would never have survived in New England. So perfect corns for each area as they moved up. Now, the final race of corn to be developed in Mexico was called Dent Corn. Dent corn had hard starch on the outside and soft starch in the middle, so when it dries, it dents. And if you walk around the fields anywhere in Illinois and look at the corn, it's going to have that little dent in it when it's mature, because dent corn is so common in this area, we actually refer to it as corn belt dent. So it is the corn we grow. It combines the long life of the Flint corn and the softer center of the flour corn. So it gives you a lot of your advantages, easier for animals to eat. Flint corn is hard for them to eat. Just so you know too, when we feed corn to animals, we don't just feed them corn, we chop up the whole plant. They get the leaves and the stems and everything else too. So when we're feeding them corn, they're not sitting there gnawing on corn on the cobs like we are. So anyway, that was the last one to be developed in Mexico. The next one to be developed wasn't actually developed until the 1600s. It was developed in the Great Lakes area by the Iroquois Indians, and that's sweet corn. Now, sweet corn, you've probably ever heard the saying about start the water boiling before you pick the corn. And that's because all corn, including popcorn, goes through a milky stage where you could pick it and eat it like sweet corn. But you have to get it into the water or the oven right away, because as soon as it's picked, there's an enzyme that starts converting the sugar into starch. In fact, there was a murder mystery, Nero Wolfe, if you're familiar with that character, Nero Wolfe, where they figured out when the farmer was murdered because he'd picked the corn and they could tell how much of the sugar had been transformed into starch. So it's one of those things where they know that happens. Now with sweet corn, that enzyme is broken. It takes several days for it to go, wait a minute, I've been picked, I should start converting the sugar. So you have 3 or 4 days. The super sweets are not actually sweeter, they just seem sweeter because it's much, much longer time before it starts converting the sugar. So you just get more sugar. It's like if you just picked it off the stalk and started eating it. So anyway, that was the final major race. There's one additional race that is just grown for genetic material because it's kind of weird, and it's called pod corn. And pod corn is strange in that every single kernel has a husk. So not very useful, but it's scientists want to have extra genetic material on hand. So they grow it a little bit, but nobody grows it commercially. Now, you may have heard of field corn. Field corn's not a race, it's a purpose. There's popcorn, there's sweet corn, everything else is field corn. Field corn is corn that falls into one or two categories. Something is done to it. Now, that something could be just grinding it for tortillas, but it could also be making ethanol. So that whole range of doing something with it, or if you're feeding it to animals. That's field corn. So you have this, the vast majority of corn grown in the United States is field corn, because that's what we need it for, is feeding it to animals, grinding it into tortillas, making it into Cheetos, all of the different things that we use for corn. And then, so popcorn and sweet corn are like 10% of the corn we grow, as opposed to field corn, which we can't do without. Now, the corn had a huge impact before the first Europeans arrived. And that impact was farming, feeding people is a lot of work. In ancient Rome, it took 19 people working in agriculture to feed one citizen of Rome. That's 95% of the population. It's the main reason that the Roman Empire grew. They took over Egypt to get the wheat. They conquered France to bring back the 4 million slaves that were going to feed them. They had to have people, they had to have lots of people, and so that was one of the reasons why they expanded their empire, was basically, we've got to keep eating, and so we need to get more land and more crops and more people. So all of a sudden, Mesoamerica, where everybody is just living the same way, just all you can do, you're conquering people and taking care of as much food as you can get, suddenly they have this crop that grows really big amounts of food, takes zero work, and women and children can pick it. It's really, really easy. It doesn't take all that much effort. And so all of a sudden you only need about 10% of the population working, which is one of the reasons why basically all of those fabulous pyramids and the mathematics and everything else that you associate with the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca, we owe to corn, because they had the free time to do it. Interestingly enough, it also presented a little bit of confusion when Europeans first arrived, because as far as Native Americans were concerned, women farmed. And so when Europeans arrived and the guys were all farming, they're like, what's wrong with this picture? Why would we want to farm? We could go out and either conquer people or hunt. Women farm. But that was one of the things that corn made possible, is this. And even here in Illinois, Cahokia, it's a town of 15,000 people, which was possible because of corn, because you could grow huge amounts of food with only 10% of the population working. So anyway, it was a huge, huge improvement. So corn had a huge impact even before Europeans arrived. Now, once Europeans arrived, the first guys to show up were, of course, the Spanish, Columbus, and then arch rivals, Portugal. And Portugal and Spain were pretty much the superpowers of their day, and it's like you had to deal with them if you were going to deal with anything, which is why it was like 100 years after Columbus before the British first got here. And that's because until the Spanish Armada was defeated, nobody went anywhere without Spanish permission. And so what the Spanish and Portuguese did is they went to the Pope and said, "Hi, we want you to divide the world." And so the Pope created a line of demarcation and divided the whole world in half between Spain and Portugal. And that's one of the reasons it went through South America, and that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese and all the rest of South America speaks Spanish. Now, one advantage to the Little Ice Age is they didn't really get very far north. I mean, Florida's as far into the continental North America or United States as they ever got, because it was really cold, and they weren't prepared to deal with that. So basically, that was the whole world was divided between the two. Portugal got Africa and India, and so they needed to feed people. They needed to feed all the people that they were about to enslave. So they thought corn was a great idea, and they started taking it back to the poor people in Europe and to the enslaved people in Africa and India. And everybody liked it, because up until then you had millet. And I don't know how much you know about millet, but millet's like those little tiny round seeds in your bird feeder. It's not bad. Kind of crunchy, pleasant, but it's a little bit dusty tasting. It's hard to harvest. Corn was really easy. It tasted good. It was lovely. Everybody loved it. Everybody adopted it wholeheartedly. But the problem is that the Spanish and Portuguese didn't learn anything from the indigenous people. The later people who came from England did, but the Spanish and Portuguese didn't. And one of the things that the Native Americans were doing is something that we call nixtamalization. It's an Aztec word. The nixtamal part is the Aztec word. We added the ization on it. But nixtamal is treating the corn with an alkaline substance, generally either lye or lime. If you get a package of tortillas, you'll still see lime on the ingredients. They're not talking about the fruit. They're talking about the alkaline substance. So they treated it, and what that did is it helped denature it a little bit so that you didn't have it spoil as quickly. But the most important thing is it freed up the lysine and the niacin. So it was not a complete food as long as you didn't treat it. So you have this corn being introduced into Africa and then into lots of Europe. And all of a sudden people, because a lot of poor people, you had one thing to eat. You had like a bowl of gruel or some bread. And that was pretty much your whole diet, and especially in the winter. In the spring, you might have some plants, you might catch some animals, but in the winter, you went for months and months with nothing except gruel. Well, if that gruel has no niacin in it, now in all fairness to these guys, niacin wasn't discovered until 1937. So it wasn't like they were trying to keep them from being healthy. It was just nobody knew. But anyway, what happened is all these poor people who are eating this are suddenly developing horrible diseases. The first symptom is dermatitis. And so the word disease got the name from Italian, pellagra, which means rough skin. So pellagra is running rampant in all of these areas. It eventually came to the United States with slaves. Once again, a seasonal disease, because in the summer when you have other things to eat, you're okay. It's just that when you're in the winter and you have nothing except your cornmeal, then you're in trouble without the niacin. So you have this disease spreading. After you go from the rough skin, you also go then to diarrhea, dementia, and if you don't get over it, if you don't get something to help, then possibly death. Although death is usually just like because the dementia, you walk it off a cliff or something. So it's not, the pellagra doesn't actually kill you, it's the side effect of the symptoms. It's one of the reasons why for centuries, Europeans were like, corn is for animals. Feed the corn to pigs. Why would anybody here eat corn? I mean, it's horrible, it will kill you. And that's why it's still left over. They're beginning to get used to it now. There's a few Mexican places over there now and serving tortillas, and sweet corn is getting popular and popcorn. But up until like the last 40 years, Europeans would not eat corn. It was awful. Most Europeans. The Italians loved it. The Italians started making polenta with it 500 years ago. So they have a 500-year tradition with corn, almost as long as we do in the United States. But interestingly enough, aside from the pellagra, one of the other problems, or one of the other things that came out of it, is one of the countries that really did adopt it was Romania, particularly the area of Transylvania. And there were other legends arising at that time that got tied up with the problems of pellagra, because one of the other symptoms of pellagra is you become very sensitive to sunlight. So it is basically because of corn and pellagra that vampires can't go out in the daylight. So anyway, once we got back here to the, you had people settling in Jamestown and New England. That's pretty much all your textbooks ever tell you, isn't it? I mean, really, can you think of a textbook that mentions corn after Jamestown, after Squanto and Pocahontas? That's pretty much where we stop. It's just like, okay, well, they were introduced corn and they were saved. John Smith understood the importance of corn. He actually said, we came here looking for gold. This is our gold. This is the gold that is going to make America. And he was absolutely right. And the nice thing is, though, is everybody really got to love it. They adored corn in the United States because you could make so many things with it. It didn't hurt that it was easy to grow and that you could grow it anywhere and that everybody could have it, and it was incredibly useful and versatile. But they also really loved it. And arguably, our first serious foodie was Thomas Jefferson. And when he was in Paris, he missed corn so badly he grew it in his garden in Paris. So it actually became one of the things that the British felt made it possible to tax us, is they said, we can tax tea because the Americans have to have tea or they won't be able to choke down all of that nasty corn. And Benjamin Franklin wrote back saying, actually wrote a letter published in one of the newspapers. It's just like, there's nothing better than hasty pudding. There's nothing better than good cornbread. There's nothing better than a hoe cake fresh off the fire. He says, we'll do fine without the tea. Thank you very much. So corn was actually tied up in why they thought they could get away with skinning us. So anyway, so corn was hugely popular. People loved corn. And one of the things they wanted was more land, because by the time 1700 rolls around, enough people have moved to the East Coast that it was getting very crowded. People were going hungry. It was getting extremely difficult to raise enough food. They wanted to move a little bit further in. Hadn't they just helped the British win the French and Indian War? Shouldn't they be able to move into Ohio? No, the king said, no, we don't want to send soldiers over to protect you. You just stay this side of the Allegheny Mountains and go hungry. So that was one of many problems that contributed to the American Revolution. But once we had the Revolution, it was like, okay, we just won this huge swath of land. They called it the Northwest Territory. It included not only Ohio, but Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana. It was the promised land. And it wasn't just land, it was corn land. Lewis and Clark had come back by this point in time, and they knew that corn grew all the way to the West Coast, so they knew they'd be able to grow it. And so everybody was very excited, and nobody ever said, I want to go get land. It was, I want corn land, because this was how Americans had gotten accustomed to not only eating, but thriving. And so they started moving westward, and because of corn, it actually made it possible to settle this region faster than any other region in the history of the world. And then, of course, you have 1804, and you add the Louisiana Purchase, and so we've now doubled the size of the Northwest Territory, and that gives us the Dakotas and Minnesota and Nebraska and Kansas, and by this time, we've gotten to be a pretty good-sized piece of land out here, and everybody wanted to be growing corn. And you think, well, why is corn so perfect for settling a region like this? Well, not only does it grow fast and easy to plant and grow everywhere, but once it comes up in the spring, you get what they call suckers. Suckers, a stalk of corn only fully develops 1 ear of corn, but it will have little ones that aren't going to develop, and if you don't pick them, they'll just shrivel and die. But if you pick them, those are those fancy little things you find in stir fry and on salad bars, the little bitty ears of corn. And so, I mean, when I was doing the book, I would interview farmers who were like, oh yeah, we go out in the spring, we'll pick a couple hundred of those, my wife will pickle some of them, I'll have them in salads. So that's available very early on in the growing season. Then in the summer, even with field corn, like I said, they call it green corn because it's not fully ripe, but you could pick it and eat it just like sweet corn if you get it cooked fast enough. So they've got sweet corn all summer long, and corn puddings, and I've got some recipes in the book if you're interested, but corn puddings and corn oysters and corn soup and all sorts of other corn chowder, wonderful dishes made with corn all summer long. And then in the winter, it's fully mature, and you've got all of your, pozole, all of your hominy, all of your grits, all of your things that you can do with dried corn all winter long. So it fed you early, it fed you late, and if you got really hungry, it's actually a close relative of sugarcane. You can always just chew on the stalk, so if you need an energy burst. So it made it very easy to move away from civilization. All you needed was a backpack, because one seed gives you a half a pound of food. With wheat, you need 100 seeds to get a half a pound of food. So if you're going to go with a backpack, and that is actually how Abraham Lincoln's grandfather started out from Massachusetts, was a backpack, a hatchet, and a rifle, and the backpack was full of corn. And he came westward, and of course the family kept moving further west until Lincoln got here, but it was one of those things where that was how an awful lot of the first settlers arrived, was coming across just through the woods. So anyway, so it's absolutely fabulous. Also, unlike wheat is hard to harvest. You need people who are strong to harvest the wheat. You have to wait till it's fully ripe, and you have to have millstones to grind it. Corn you could just pound with a rock. Corn you can eat just off of the thing. You can just boil it. You don't have to grind it. So there's so many reasons for it to be ideal. Now, how fast? I said it was faster than any other region in the history of the world. How fast was that? Well, you have 1900, The Wizard of Oz is published. And everybody buys the image of Kansas being this boring place of cornfields. That's only 24 years after Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp were first hired in Kansas as lawmen. So you go from the wild, wild west to no place like home in one generation. That's really fast. Now, interestingly, everything that grew caused not only farms to grow, but cities to grow, because farmers are not going to get wealthy if they don't have someplace to sell the corn. And cities can't survive at all without farms. So cities and farms were growing pretty much at the same time. And this is another speedy one. 1833, the government buys a small patch of swampy land on the shore of Lake Michigan. 60 years later, the 1893 World's Fair. I mean, seriously, 60 years. We go from a small trading post with a handful of Native Americans and a few French trappers to a city of over 1 million people that could put on a World's Fair that the people still talk about today. So that's fast. The other thing, too, is that 1893 World's Fair was only 20 years after the Great Chicago Fire. And the reason that helped is because the part that burned was downtown. The south side, which is where all the corn was, didn't. And so basically that's one of the reasons why we became such like a great melting pot for architects to come from all over the world, is because we had lots of money and it just flattened downtown, but we still had all the money coming in. So it was a huge opportunity, but it was all because of the corn. Now, people of the time understood this. I mean, it's like I always figure people are going to go, well, of course you think corn is cool. You wrote a book about corn. But people at the time understood that. And this is actually from a speech given by Governor Richard Oglesby in 1892 in Chicago. I, the corn, the royal corn, within whose yellow heart there is of health and strength for all the nations, the corn triumphant, that with the aid of man hath made victorious procession across the tufted plain and laid foundations for the social excellence that is and is to be. So they got it. So what changed? Now, there's a lot that was changing other than just lots of farms where there used to be wilderness. One of the big things that changed in the mid-1800s is Illinois jumped on an idea from a guy named Joseph Dart, who came up with this idea of a grain elevator. And Illinois was just like all over it. And it was like by the early or about mid-1800s, they were ready with grain elevators because we were growing a lot of grain. And so it was questioned how we would now grade the corn, because up until this time, all grain was sewn into 2-bushel bags, which had the disadvantage of needing to be carried everywhere you went. You had to carry it onto the boat, you had to carry it into the wagon, you had to carry it into the warehouse. But it had the farmer's name on it, so you knew whose grain you were getting. Oh, Farmer Jones, that's great grain. I can always buy his grain. So now you have a device where you just have a huge wagon full of corn. You back it into the grain elevator. Somebody pulls a lever. It dumps all the grain into the basement, and you push a button, and it takes all of the corn up and drops it into bins up above. And when it's time to ship it, you push a button, and it just races down into wagon, boat, train car, whatever is available at the time. And so you go from needing hundreds of people to spend all day carrying the stuff to being able to load 24,000 bushels in an hour. Absolutely transferred everything. But of course, some people were a little slow to pick up on that. People sort of made fun of it at first. And what happened, because they were worried too about grading. So a bunch of guys got together in Chicago in 1948, and they decided they would pull together a little private club where they could grade the corn and they could handle the selling of the corn in these bins and everything else. And they decided to call their little group the Chicago Board of Trade. We do find that people had very ambitious names back then. It could be 4 guys, and it would be the American whatever company, but the Chicago Board of Trade, and people made fun of them. They thought it was stupid, they thought it was ridiculous, until '53 and the Crimean War started, and suddenly Europe needed huge quantities of grain. And Chicago could just push a button and fill your boat. And everybody suddenly wanted to be part of the Chicago Board of Trade. 3 years later, in 1856, the guys at the Chicago Board of Trade said, you know, we have telegraphs now. We can find out what Farmer Jones is growing. We could buy future corn. So 1848 to 1856, we completely transform how corn is shipped. No more bags. You had to define bushels by weight rather than by volume at this point. 56 pounds a bushel. So how we ship it, how we process it, how we grade it, and futures are being introduced. So in 6 years, we transformed the whole world, and of course everybody's scrambling to catch up because it made sense. It saved lives. It was wonderful. One place, though, that didn't benefit was St. Louis. St. Louis used to be the center, the capital of the Midwest. If you go to St. Louis in their train station, they actually have this fabulous stained glass window that shows the 3 important cities in the United States: New York, San Francisco, and St. Louis. And St. Louis was at the head of the Mississippi, which was very important. It still is, just not as important as being in Chicago, because St. Louis had slaves. They were not interested in having grain elevators because they had all these guys they bought to carry the stuff onto the boats. So they completely missed that. And so once the Civil War was over and they didn't have the slaves, it was like, what do we do with the corn now? So they did eventually catch up. They do have grain elevators now, but it really knocked them out of the ballpark from the standpoint of being the premier city of the Midwest at that point. So this is when Chicago ran forward. Then the other thing that happened, of course, is by the time of the Civil War comes, we're building railroads, lots of railroads. An awful lot of the railroads are now being turned into paths, nature trails and stuff like that, because we don't need quite as many, because we now use trucks for a lot of what it was, because we used to have hundreds and hundreds of trains coming through, because everything coming from the farms came by train. So you had vast numbers of these Granger railroads coming into especially Chicago, but everywhere. I mean, I was down in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they said that they get 1 train a day now, and 50 years ago it was 200 a day. So a considerable difference. So you had all of these trains coming into Chicago, but we're working in a world where everybody's still just kind of going, yeah, it's noon. So you look at the sky and you know it's noon. How do you create a schedule with that? So the train companies in Chicago got together and said, okay, if we're going to be shipping grain, we have to come up with a way of having a schedule. So the train companies in Chicago divided the country into 4 sections and said, well, we're the central section, so this will be central time, and it's going to all be standardized. And on November 18th, 1883, everybody in the central zone changed their watches to the time on the 90th meridian. And then they told everybody else to figure it out an hour at a time based on that. So 1883, we got time zones because of Chicago train companies. It was 35 years before the US government went, you know, this is working pretty well. Let's make this official. So basically Chicago owned that too. Now, one of the other things that was inspired, this was not directly related to corn, but it was inspired by all these trains coming in and going back empty, is there was a young man in Chicago who knew how hard it was for farmers at the time, because Illinois was really swampy before we got drainage tiles and could drain a lot of this area. I mean, malaria was a problem here. So you had all of this swampy land. It made travel very difficult. Farmers were very much cut off for most of the year. So this guy figured, okay, I have a way I can supply all the farmers out there. The guy's name was Aaron Montgomery Ward. And he came up with a catalog. And so all of a sudden the trains are all going back out to the farms filled with stuff that the farmers need. So it was another 20 years before Sears and Roebuck came along, but that was a huge change. Now, one other thing too, just because we're in the Chicagoland area, I'll also mention another thing that happened is that the impact made Chicago very wealthy. And one perfect example is a guy named Ebenezer Buckingham, who owned a couple of grain elevators. He made a lot of money. His son, Clarence Buckingham, became the president of the Corn Exchange Bank. And when Clarence died, his sister Kate, mourning his loss, used a small fraction of her fortune to build Buckingham Fountain. So it was real money to be made from corn. So it was a big deal. Now then, of course, corn made stock yards possible, because if you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cattle, what were you going to do with it in Europe? You didn't have anything you could feed to them. You couldn't feed them wheat. You couldn't feed them. There was not enough grass. So basically, stockyards, the whole idea of the stockyards, it started in Ohio, and it grew here because we were growing this stuff that we could feed to animals. And so stockyards started to explode. In the mid-1800s, Cincinnati became known as Porkopolis, because so many pigs were being butchered there and processed there. And it's one of the reasons it became such a big, it's sort of one of the corners of the German triangle, as they call it, which is the St. Louis, Cincinnati, Milwaukee. So that's the German triangle, where you have a lot of people settling because of the pork being processed there. So you've got Porkopolis there. Now, one of the things they did is they developed a method called the disassembly line. because it took a long time for families to butcher pigs. I mean, it could take like your whole day for the family to get a hog butchered. The disassembly line got it down to 35 seconds. You had two guys moving the pig around while the guys cut it up. Well, once the Civil War started, a lot of the butchering started to move to Chicago. And at the end of the Civil War, that's when the Union stockyards were created. And the Union stockyards refined the disassembly line. And a young guy from Detroit named Henry Ford saw the disassembly line and said, you know, if you did this in reverse, you could put things together. So most people think that the disassembly line was a riff on the assembly line, but it wasn't. The assembly line was basically because of cutting up pigs. So anyway, so without the stockyards, you wouldn't have a car. So anyway, and just so you know too, it's hard for us today to even imagine how big the stockyards were in Chicago. But in the mid-1800s, or actually by 1900, the Chicago Union stockyards provided 82% of all the meat consumed in the United States. So it really was, as Carl Sandburg said, hog butcher for the world. Now, corn was not just transforming things, it was being transformed. Pigs was one of the ways it was transformed. Pigs were known as cornfields on legs. Because before we had trains everywhere, how did you get your corn to market? You fed it to a pig and had him walk. In fact, the first major breed developed in the Midwest, the Poland China, developed in Ohio, was developed because it could be fed up to market weight and walk 1,000 miles. So that was how you got it back. And it was like, I'm really grateful for the short amount of time that we had cowboys in this country, because pig boys and Indians just doesn't cut it. But anyway, but that's what we did. We'd have 10, 15, 20,000 pigs being driven eastward, because that was how the East Coast was eating, was basically the Midwest was feeding the whole rest of the country. So you had these tens of thousands of pigs, but they were called cornfields on legs. Once we had trains, you could breed pigs for things like tasting good. But up until then, it was just how long can you stay alive, on the road. So they were turned into pigs. The other popular thing that they were turned into was whiskey. Corn was really popular for making whiskey. A lot of towns would just have a still where you would take a bushel of grain and they would send you home with a gallon of whiskey. But nobody did it like Peoria. By the mid-1800s, Peoria was the whiskey capital of the world. It made 186,000 gallons of whiskey a day. It made so much whiskey that taxes on Peoria whiskey were 50% of the federal budget. Which is why in 1919, when we had Prohibition, that they had to scramble to raise taxes and everything else, because they lost 50% of their budget by ending drinking. But Peoria was huge. It was the #1 consumer of corn in the country. And they also had dairies and other things there, but the whiskey was where most of the corn was going. So that was a popular thing. But then as time went by, other things started getting made. In 1842, a gentleman named Thomas Kingsford was working for a British company that was making starch out of wheat. And he thought, well, this is stupid. We live in the United States and we grow corn. Why don't we try to figure out how to make starch from corn? So Kingsford, and if anybody here bakes, you've probably seen Kingsford starch in the stores, but Kingsford came up with a way of making starch from corn. And he moved to Chicago because this was a great place to have a business if you were doing corn. So he made a lot of money. And another guy named Gene Staley was attracted to that. He thought, I could do that too. Gene Staley moved to Decatur and started a cornstarch company in 1906 and made a whole lot of money. Decided to give a little something back to the community. So he started a sports team that he called the Decatur Staleys. But then in 1920, they changed the name to the Chicago Bears. So no corn, no bears. And then in the late 1800s, you had a vegetarian doctor in Battle Creek, Michigan, deciding that the world should have cold cereal for breakfast. Yes, Dr. John Kellogg. Now, John Kellogg had a huge sanitarium that everybody with money in the whole world came to. I mean, presidents and movie stars. And if you've ever been to Battle Creek, it's like 3 blocks long and 4 stories high, and it's magnificent, and it's just hard to even imagine somebody having that kind of thing built around your diet and nutrition. But his brother thought, oh, we should market this. And Dr. Kellogg is, no, everybody has to come here if they want to, have our cereal. And that's the other thing too, is if you find out how it's made, it's hard to conceive how anybody thought that was natural food. But anyway, it's one of those things where he wanted everybody to come there for it. But one of the patients there figured out how he could reproduce it. That patient was named C.W. Post.
Oh, wow.
And with C.W. Post, we had the beginning of the cereal wars, because that was when Dr. John Kellogg was suddenly convinced that it would be a good idea to be packaging the original and getting it out on the market. So huge amount of sort of marketing combat there. Then in the late 1800s, Theodore Hudnut in Terre Haute, Indiana, figured out that you could in fact extract a small amount of oil from the germ of the corn, which was usually taken out when you processed it for other things. And so instead of just throwing out the germ, he was turning it into corn oil, which is why Terre Haute is known as the home of corn oil today. So a lot of stuff going on. Now, the late 1800s also saw a lot of life changes and the beginning of our love affair with snack foods. Part of the reason there were changes is all sorts of things were getting much easier. You know, it's hard to imagine, like, washing machines and irons are easy, but compared to having to heat your iron on the stove and to keep changing the iron and having 5 irons, or taking all the rugs outside to beat them, or scrubbing something on a scrubbing board, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, these were all absolute revelations. Suddenly people had free time, they could go to things, plus of course you could travel. If you could get on a train, it was faster and easier to get places, so you didn't have to spend as much time. I mean, instead of taking 3 weeks to get to your vacation destination, you took 1 day and you could spend a weekend or a week. So suddenly people are traveling, they have free time. You've got the Chicago Bears, you've got all these things going on. World's fairs are popping up in the Midwest. So people have free time, and what do you do when you have free time? You want to eat stuff. Now, 1893 at the World's Fair, one of our most popular American snacks was introduced by C.C. Creeters from Chicago, and he was saying, try the new taste sensation, hot buttered popcorn. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that popcorn arrived in the mid-1800s, around the time of the Civil War, but up until then, popcorn, nobody really knew what to do with popcorn. You put it on the hearth and let it pop and tried to catch it before it caught fire, or you had it in a wire basket over a flame and it was dried, it was nasty. And so it's like, if you look at cookbooks from the late 1800s, it's like, use it as croutons in salads or soup, pound it small and pour milk on it and eat it like cereal. Or the most popular thing of all, pour goop on it and make it into popcorn balls. So nobody was eating hot buttered popcorn, it didn't exist. Now, the reason that Creeters was giving it away for free is because he didn't invent popcorn, he invented the popper. And if you've ever been to a movie theater and seen one of those ones where it's like a bowl with like a symbol on top that's popping up and down, that's what he invented. And C.C. Creeters is still here in Chicago, still making popcorn machines, and his great-great-grandson runs it today. This is one of the things I love about corn, is so much of it is a family story. And so anyway, so we were introduced to popcorn. Interestingly enough, once popcorn machines existed, and he put them on wheels so you could take them places. It was like the introduction of the food truck. It was the first way of getting food out to the people. So, and they still make those, and they're beautiful things. But anyway, so you've got C.C. Creeters, you got the popcorn machine. But up until this point in time, popcorn was pretty much one of those things where it's like, you had a farm and you said to your kid, okay, I'm going to give you 1 acre, you can grow popcorn and sell it at the local store, and you know, good luck. And the reason you could do that is popcorn will actually not accept pollen from other forms of corn. So it will never cross with anything else. So you could keep it completely separate. So that was how popcorn was grown, which meant it was incredibly inconsistent and you had no idea what quality you were getting. So a guy named Cloyd Smith over in Sioux City, Iowa, decided that Americans deserved better popcorn. And so he got together with his wife and kids, planted a whole lot of popcorn, and they aged it and they packaged it in their basement. And the first year they did it, they packaged 75,000 pounds of popcorn. And he called it the American Popcorn Company, because like I said, people had big names back then. They really liked stuff, had big plans, and they had such a jolly time doing it that sort of became the name of the popcorn. So Jolly Time Popcorn, still in the Smith family today. Not incidentally, Cloyd Smith also invented Cornhuskers lotion. So, because if you and your family are actually picking 75,000 pounds of popcorn yourself. Anyway, so a lot of history. He sold the Cornhuskers, but Jolly Time is still in the family. So anyway, then in the 1930s, a guy from Kansas named Charles Dulin was driving across the Southwest. 1930s, Big Depression going on, and he stopped at a garage, and there was a Mexican guy there frying little bits of dough, and he said, "I'll give you $100 for the recipe." And so the Mexican guy's going, $100. I mean, that was a lot of money during the Depression. So he's like, "You bet." So Charles Dulin went home, created his own breed of corn to keep the flavor consistent. And if you know the word in Spanish for fried, you'll know we just got Fritos. And then up in Wisconsin, the Flake-All Rabbit Food Company was having problems with one of their rabbit food machines. So they brought an engineer in, and you know how you put something hard in the garbage disposal to clean it? Well, in this case, he thought, well, maybe something hard in the rabbit food machine will help. So he's throwing handfuls of dried corn in to the rabbit food machine, and suddenly it's spitting out these puffy things. And in a moment of inspiration, he sweeps them all up, takes them to his wife, she fries them, and it's Wisconsin, so they put cheese on them, and they market them as corn curls. And so if you have a bag of Cheetos today, you can thank a broken rabbit food machine in Wisconsin. So anyway, snack food kept growing. Everything was changing, though. It's one of those things where it's hard to even imagine how different the world was like 150 years ago. I've been to Egypt, and in Egypt you'll see pictures, paintings of farmers, and it's like a guy with a wooden plow behind 2 oxen. And if you see a picture of farming in Illinois in the 1850s, it's a guy with a wooden plow and 2 oxen. So it's like, and now it's a spaceship. You know, it's just one of those things, everything has changed completely in the last 150 years. 4,000 years of nothing, and then boom. See, it took the Midwest to get that going. But now some of the stuff, though, preserving, for instance, we tend to think of preserving as being such an ancient art. Well, it wasn't actually discovered or developed until the mid-1800s by Napoleon and his army. Well, early 1800s. Napoleon and his army, because as Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach. And so he wanted a way of taking food out to the countryside with the farm, or with the soldiers. And so 1809 is when the very first canned food occurred. And I'm talking in glass jars, the things we think of when we talk about home canning. And that didn't exist before 1809. So still a relatively new technology, just a couple hundred years old. Well, the British immediately saw that and went, what a great idea, but let's put it in tin because it doesn't break as easily. And by the Civil War, it was in the United States, and absolutely everybody went nuts for it here. And the single oldest brand name that's still being used is for Underwood canned deviled ham, which goes back to the 1800s. But one of the very first things that was canned was also sweet corn. 1842, the first sweet corn was canned, and it is today, and this always amuses me, it's the most popular vegetable in the United States. And the thing that's amusing is that it's not a vegetable, as you probably know. It's just sort of like that argument of like, are tomatoes fruits or vegetables? Are cucumbers fruits or vegetables? Well, nobody's ever thought corn was a vegetable until the FDA got involved, or the USDA. But the nice thing is that means you can have a bowl of popcorn, and because a couple of government departments call it a vegetable and a couple call it a whole grain, like one bowl of popcorn, you've pretty much covered the whole pyramid. So anyway, everything's changing. Cooking, 1834 is when we got the first home stoves, and those are the ones that you had to throw logs into. So everything has been pretty unbelievable in the last 100 years or so, 150 years. Now, the other thing that was changing was the Midwest. Waves of settlers. I mean, at first, the people were coming in from the upland south and from New England, and you can kind of see that divide if you go through. It's like if I go to Wisconsin for breakfast, I'll be having, scrambled eggs. If I go to southern Illinois, I'll be having sausage gravy over biscuits. It's like you could see pretty much where the upland south came as opposed to the New Englanders, because there's that divide. There's very much a southern influence as you get further south. Grits are very often on the menu. So it's one of those things where that was the original. But by the late 1800s, people were coming over in huge droves. You had Chinese coming in from China building the Continental Railroad. And interestingly enough, everybody tells you in school about how badly they were treated in California, but the Midwest went, come on. And so they settled here. By 1900, we had Chinese restaurants and Chinatowns in pretty much all of the Midwestern cities. So they were far much more welcome here and far more established. So all the oldest Chinese places are pretty much in the Midwest. But you also had Europeans coming over in huge numbers, especially once we had like the Homestead Act. So you had people coming over from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe. This is when, and it's one of the reasons the Midwest is the most ethnically diverse region in the country. People tend to think of diversity as being English speaking and Spanish speaking, but here we've got Russian and Polish and Czech and Dutch and it's just like hundreds of different groups have settled here, and so the influences have been immense, and so a lot of that happened right after the Civil War, all the way up till about 1910. So you have this huge influx of people from overseas. Now, one of the things that did is that you had people coming over and wanting to grow wheat, because everybody in Europe knew that rich people ate wheat bread. And so they started growing that, but then they started to realize it's like, if you want to survive in the United States, you grow corn. You can also grow wheat, but you have to have corn for your animals, you have to have corn for the market, you have to have corn for so many other reasons. So they all kept growing corn. But the other thing that happened is, of course, after the Civil War and in the beginning of the 1900s, you had the Great Migration with huge numbers of African Americans coming up from the South. And in the South, even when cotton was king, they actually grew more corn than they grew cotton. So it was very much a corn culture. So they brought all their corn traditions. By 1893, we had Mexicans starting coming to the Midwest to settle and to work in the farm fields and everything else. That was one of the things that was kind of fun. One of the guys I interviewed is the president of Azteca Foods, and he's obviously of Mexican descent, but it's like his kids went to Notre Dame. He was born in Ohio. It's just like I said, why are you talking to me when nobody else will? And he says, because I am a Midwesterner. So it's one of those things where a lot of them have been here for 4 and 5 generations. Huge presence in Minnesota because of the sugar beets. So they brought a strong corn culture with them. In fact, interestingly enough, if you test, there are DNA tests they can do for how much corn you eat, and we test about even with Mexico in the Midwest, because we're eating just enough Cheetos to match up with them on tortillas. So anyway, so you have that, but then of course you have the Italians coming over with their 500-year history, and the thing that amuses me is that, it's like you've got the younger generation kind of going, ooh, cornmeal mush. Now, like every older farmer I talked to, that was their fondest memory of growing up, was having cornmeal mush in the morning. But cornmeal mush is sort of going away because everybody sees that as being old-fashioned and everything else, but everybody's willing to shell out money for polenta, which is cornmeal mush. So anyway, so you have the cornmeal mush is still with us, but you have all these different influences that keep strengthening that, and of course walk down the snack food aisle and try to find something that, other than potato chips, there is nothing but corn. So it's just one of those things. Corn has remained a strong part of our culture. Now, Margaret Visser, I always love that. Much Depends on Dinner is a classic book of food history, and she has a quote that says, "Without corn, North America, and most particularly modern technological North America, is inconceivable." And that's because now 1% of our population farms. Everybody else is involved in doing something like creating computers, putting men on the moon. Just, astonishing amount of technology is possible, even greater than the Aztecs and the Maya, because we have so few people that have to be farming in order to feed us all. Sadly, there's that divide, and this has actually started with the Chicago Board of Trade, that divide where we no longer think of food as coming from farms, we think of food as coming from grocery stores. And so it's one of those, in fact, that was one of I have a quote in there from a woman I met in Ohio, which is like, I don't know why farmers have to work so hard, you can get everything you need at the grocery store. So anyway, not everybody's quite that far off of reality, but there is still this great divide where people don't know where their food comes from. And so I think it's important to have some idea. I always love this quote from Dwight Eisenhower. He just says, "Farming looks mighty easy when your plow is a pen and you're 1,000 miles from the field." And it's really true. It's really hard work, which, by the way, if you're interested at all in farming, I have a blog, MidwestMaize.com. And on the blog, I have been posting videos from some of the farmers that do video channels, have video channels, because they do some beautiful work, and it can really sometimes show you not only how smart and sophisticated farmers are, they're not a bunch of hayseeds, but just how beautiful farming is. So anyway, Corn is grown pretty much everywhere in the United States, but there are like 4 states that own corn. More than 50% is grown in those 4 states. Iowa's number 1, probably always will be. Illinois is number 2, Nebraska and Minnesota. So those 4 states grow more than 50% of all the corn, even though every state grows corn. 73 million acres of corn being grown. We grow more corn than wheat and rice combined. We feed the world. Now, a major enemy, one of the things that's interesting, people tend to think of, oh, the corporate farms, that's scary, that's what's going to... No, actually, suburban sprawl is the enemy of farms. An awful lot of suburbs are spreading out. A lot of the farmers I interviewed used to live closer to the cities that they're near but the city needed to grow. And so you have some huge housing development where there used to be a farm. So anyway, that's the biggest enemy. The other biggest problem, of course, is old farmers. Not everybody wants to farm. It's really hard work. You pretty much don't do anything except farm. If you're not planting something, you're fixing the equipment that you need to harvest it. So it's a huge amount of work. And so it's one of the reasons I like organizations like the Land Connection, where they're trying to get people interested in farming, helping farmers whose kids don't want to farm, trying to connect them with people that might want to farm their land. So it's really important. But the other thing to remember is that most of it's family farms. You know, you see these Chipotle ads, which makes it look like factories are raising our food. 90% of all corn is grown on a family farm. Now, they're really big farms now, because if you're spending $350,000 on a combine, you can't use it on 5 acres. You need 1,000 acres. But it's just one of those things where, and also since nobody wants to farm, if you only have 1% of the population, and I shouldn't say nobody wants to, because some have just gone broke and left, but a lot of it is their kids they want to go to school and they want to get jobs at making computers, and the farm has got nobody to take it over, so they sell it to the next door neighbor. So it's just something to keep in mind. It may be big farms, but it is still family farms. So anyway, we can't take it for granted, but it's always good to appreciate where our food comes from. So I will close with this because it's time to close. I always say that you could tell how important something is to a culture when it starts entering the literature. And there is a huge amount of literature that revolves around corn. And this is a poem written by Edna Dean Proctor in 1893. The rose may bloom for England, the lily for France unfold. Ireland may honor the shamrock, Scotland her thistle bold. But the shield of the great republic, the glory of the West, shall bear a stalk of tasseled corn, of all our wealth the best. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming out. And